Good morning, everyone. Cool. Sorry. All right. Well, this is my first time teaching the adult Bible class, so I feel like I'm playing on expert mode, and I hope I hope it all goes well. I am excited to teach this morning. I've done this material for the junior high and high school classes before, and they seemed to really enjoy it. I really think it's interesting, so I hope you guys will appreciate it. It's a lot of science type stuff, and I don't know everything about all of this stuff, but I have studied a fair amount on it. So if I get something wrong, just let me know, or if you want to add something, feel free. The one thing that is a little different about this Bible class this morning, we're going to be studying apologetics, and we're going to be studying existence for the evidence of God. And so, let me go ahead and turn this on. Hey, there we go. Okay. It's called The Case for the Creator. And one thing that's different about this Bible class that's going to be different than a lot of the other Bible classes is we're not going to be using this hardly at all. If I'm going to try to prove God to you, I can't use his book. Because if you don't believe in God, you certainly don't believe in his book. You can't just say, well, God says he exists, because if you open to Genesis 1:1 and you pull it up, it says he created the heavens and the earth. If I gave you a Quran and said you should believe in their version of God, you would look at me like I had a third eye in my head. Same thing if I gave you, a Buddhist book or a Hindu book, you'd say, yeah, but show me something else first, then I'll look at your book. And so we're not going to be using the Bible. We're going to try and find God from scratch, essentially. And so you don't have to read all this. This doesn't have to be like a lecture. This can be interactive. We can talk. I just got a little carried away. If you're looking at this, it's never going to be the case where God's going to show up out of the blue and you're going to be like, oh, well, there he is. I can go over. I can meet him. I can see what he looks like. You're never going to get to that point of the analogy. You have to weigh the scales. You have to say, what's reasonable considering the evidence that we have at this point? If you go to a murder trial and there's 3 pieces of evidence against the defendant, 5 pieces for him, you have to weigh the scales. What's the most reasonable outcome given that situation? If you go to a murder trial and there's 10,000 pieces of evidence for convicting somebody versus 0 or 1 that he gets off, then you come to a much different conclusion. If you go to the murder trial and they've got gunshot residue on his person, they've got his fingerprints on the gun, they've got a camera showing him shooting the guy. At some point, it just becomes obvious what actually happened. And the same thing happens in when you're looking at the evidence for God. At some point, there's enough evidence where a reasonable person who doesn't get to see God can find that he exists anyway. And that's kind of the things that we're going to be looking at. All right, step 1. We're going to find God from the laws of science. How did the universe get here? The Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory. Okay? How else did the universe get here? God spoke it into being. What's the third option? It's always existed. Exactly. It either spontaneously came out of nothing, it just popped out of existence. It's always been here forever. Or it was created by something else. It was created by something else that had the power and the ability to do it. Okay? The universe spontaneously came out of nothing. How reasonable is this? And we're talking nothing. We're not talking like nothing in the middle of space. We're talking just, there's, like in space, in the spaces in between all the stuff, there's actually like what they call cosmic background radiation and all sorts of other things. So there is actually stuff that makes up the middle of space. And like there's dark matter, but we're talking absolutely nothing. So is there anything that prevents this from happening?
There's not enough energy to drive the reaction because there is no energy.
Because there is no energy, right. There is no energy, there is no matter, there is no nothing. All right. Tell me about some of the laws of physics. What's a law of physics that y'all know about?
For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Okay, one of Newton's laws, okay. Matter is neither created nor destroyed. Which one is that one? That's the first. First law of thermodynamics, okay. What about some of the other ones? Law of entropy, perfect. Gravity, absolutely. Big fan of that one. Anybody else? Any aviation guys? E equals MC squared. There you go. Jump right to Einstein, get the good stuff. All right. Gravity, electromagnetism, hydrodynamics, aerodynamics, all of these things. When you're looking at a law of physics, what is the baseline of how these things are cataloged? Like, what has to happen in order for it to be classified as a law of science? Repeatable, for sure. Provable. Also has to be observable, absolutely. Anything else? Testable. Has to be the same everywhere at every point in time also. You can't have it work sometimes, and then it doesn't work the other times. They're also usually governed by fairly simple math equations. So it's not always the case that's true, but most of these have very simple underlying math that explains how they work and shows how they work on an everyday basis. Okay? Universal, simple, absolute, stable. Yes. Okay. Perfect. Anything less than this, and you get a theory. Okay? Theories can be tested, they can be modified, and they can ultimately be proved true or false. You can have a theory for a couple hundred years, and then something else will come along, and it will either prove or disprove it. You can have something that you really think is true, like, is it?
Flat Earth.
Yeah, I was going to say flat Earth too, but spontaneous generation. Does anybody know of other theories that they held for a long time that were disproven? It's kind of a hard thing to remember because you don't ever learn about those, or you learn about them kind of on the sidelines of science text. Grant, help me out, man. Do what? Okay. I love Grant. Grant always teaches me something new when we do these classes. All right. So, we're going to learn about the laws of thermodynamics for this part of the class. And I know you guys have talked about this before. So, if you don't know about it, I'll try and be brief. If you do know about it, you'll get a quick refresher. So, the first law states, internal energy of an isolated system is constant. Okay? Someone explain to me what that says in non-science speak. What's that in non-science? If you were just going to tell me what that means on the street. Can't be created or destroyed. So you can measure this inside really precise labs. You can burn logs inside of a really isolated chamber, and you can measure all the pieces of energy that come off from it. You can measure the heat energy, the radiation energy. You can weigh the materials before and after, and you will come up with an equation that balances perfectly, minus, to the degree of accuracy of the closed system, okay? And then the second law of thermodynamics states that heat cannot spontaneously flow from a colder location to a hotter location. Energy is always moving from more dense states to less dense states, okay? So when you heat something up on the stove, what happens is the energy goes into the pot of boiling water, and then if you turn it off, it slowly dissipates throughout the room. It gets transferred to the walls of the pot, and then those slowly go throughout the room. It does not work in the reverse. So imagine what our world would look like if heat could spontaneously flow from a cold location to a warm location. It's really kind of hard to wrap your mind around it. So imagine did I put a picture in here? I did not. Imagine a thermal image, okay? And we'll just picture a thermal image of a car for right now. When the car is going around, what are the hot spots in the car? The engine. What's one of the other hot spots? Tires, for sure. Absolutely. The brakes, if you're going to use them. Okay? So imagine if you got this car and you have the engine and it's sitting there making a bunch of heat because it's generating power. Imagine if it was taking all the cold energy from around it and it was flowing into the engine instead of being dissipated out through the radiators and everything. So it was driving just through the country road, and all of the cold, average temperatures that were around it were flowing into the engine. And it was getting hotter and hotter and hotter until it actually melts. That is what would happen if the second law of thermodynamics wasn't true. All of the heat in the universe would find itself getting concentrated into smaller and smaller and denser spaces. And it would be really chaotic. So if you had two competing heat sources, they would both take energy from around them, and then depending on how the heat was flowing, they would be trying to transfer energy back and forth between each other or combining into a single mass. The sun would be getting hotter and hotter and hotter instead of slowly losing energy as it is. Basically, the world would be a mess. Like if you lit a fire in a forest for a campfire, and then it would just consume everything. Nothing would work the way that you would think it would. Everything would be really, really chaotic. It's kind of a crazy thing to think about. Okay. So I showed this to the kids just so that they would know what we use these things for. We have power generation, our favorite air conditioning. So fun story, we went to DC this summer, and in the Capitol, each state gets to have 2 marble or granite statues of famous people that came from your state. One of the ones from Florida is the guy who invented the air conditioning. And he's been up there for quite a while, and I was like, yeah, that makes complete sense. So, all these other states have, like Thomas Jefferson and, Rosa Parks and all of like these super important figures in politics and history, and we get the guy who invents air conditioning, but it makes sense for us. We like it. Okay. So imagine what happens if the first law didn't hold. If the energy of an isolated system wasn't constant, there's very little that we could predict about how our world would actually work. So almost all of the work, force, and energy physics equations suddenly break down. So we can't predict, if you take a machine and it's going to apply a force to moving something, if the energy of the isolated system, if it doesn't hold that way, the math equation doesn't work anymore. The same thing for all the energy equations. None of them work anymore, and the same thing for all the work equations. So there's a whole lot that we're able to predict about our world because all of these things happen in a predictable manner, okay? You can't predict how fast a car would drive. You can't predict how much power you get out of a machine. All sorts of things that you really need to know if you're going to be engineering something like this, they don't work anymore, okay? Oh, there it is. I found it. Okay, so we talked about this one. And the second part about this, the interesting thing about this is that if the second law doesn't work, it also implies things don't wear out. So, if heat doesn't spontaneously flow from hot to cold locations, it means that energy doesn't move from more dense states to less dense states. What the second law says is the energy of the universe is slowly getting used up. The second law says, we started with this much, and over time, we are gradually using it up, okay? Yes?
You wouldn't technically say you're using it up because it's neither created or destroyed. It's becoming less accessible.
It's becoming less accessible. Exactly. Yes. But we're going to have less accessible energy from every state moving forward. Is that correct? Okay. Okay. So if energy or matter cannot be created or destroyed, as in Law 1, then the universe cannot have created itself or appeared out of nothing. And this all makes sense. Like, we don't ever think that something just appears out of nothing. If I come home today and I find a zebra in my house, I don't assume that the zebra appeared out of nothing and just showed up in my house. I assume like one of my friends is playing a really big prank on me at that point, Second point, if all of the energy in our universe is moving from more dense states to less dense states, okay, slowly becoming less usable, then the universe cannot have existed forever. There's a lot of energy in the universe, and we still have a lot of energy in the universe, but it is slowly going away. It's slowly getting to these states where it's less usable and less usable. The sun is burning hydrogen, and eventually, in the far distant future, it's going to run out, okay? And the same thing is happening with everything else in the universe. So if you're talking about the universe itself, okay, some people will say, well, yeah, but the Earth and the sun is not a closed system, okay? Well, yeah, it isn't, because things from outside the universe interact with our solar system. But if you're talking about the universe, if we're going to go from edge to edge of the entire universe, the parts that we can't even see yet, okay, then that is a closed system because nothing else is coming into or out of it because nothing else exists on the edges of it, okay? And so therefore, it cannot have created itself or appeared out of nothing, and it cannot have existed forever. Because at some point in the distant past, there was a whole lot more, and then we're moving to the point where we're going to eventually run out. Okay. Therefore, you're left with the only other logical conclusion. Something bigger and more powerful than the universe caused it to come into existence. All right. We are moving quickly. All right. Step 2. How ancient civilizations knew that God existed. Okay? Caleb talked about this at one point. Does anyone know how this comes from about the 1100s in the Middle East? Does anybody know how the ancients knew that God existed? Well, we can use ours. Like, how did the Jews know that God existed?
Well, Romans 1 was pretty clear that they could look all around them and see that God existed.
Okay.
And then they would just describe their own deity or whatever the case may be, depending on their background.
Okay. What's something else?
Prophets.
There was the prophets. Absolutely. The prophets did some pretty amazing things. Chris talked about a week or two ago how Elijah asked God to send heaven from fire from heaven down to blow up the altar. Okay, pretty convincing stuff. There was the patriarchs, absolutely. And how did they know? They spoke with God. They got the face-to-face contact in one instance. Okay. What if you didn't belong to the ancient, if you weren't part of the Israelites? How would you know, how would you think you could figure it out if God existed? Anybody have any ideas?
No, it was passed down from generation to generation. If we're looking at the patriarchal age, when God spoke directly to people, his message to the fathers was, pass this along to your children. And just because one set of children became Israel and the others did not, doesn't mean that the fathers didn't pass that information along.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, absolutely. It's not a world of chaos. It is not a world of chaos. There's a precise order to a lot of things. And so what does that, expand on that a little bit further, George.
You get up each morning, you know the sun's coming. The ancients, you go around, even travel in America, the Indians had mounds built. Even the Indians in America had mounds built, knowing the position of the sun, and they could tell the seasons because of what they call the equinox. But the sun would rise and set, and it would get higher in the sky each day, and through the years, they could tell where the sun was. They built those mounds in accordance to the way the sun was, or stars were.
Mm-hmm.
They saw all that order.
For sure. Yeah, there's a lot of
And there was something that kept everything in order.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of predictability about how the world works today. Is anybody else?
Yeah, I was going to say even if you weren't the ancient Israelites, the fact is they other people would still know from the works of God that had already been demonstrated. Take for example his deliverance of the Israelites from Egyptian bondage. Everyone knew about everything that had happened because of his great works, because of the miracles that had happened. So all of that was going around, that knowledge of what God had done for them, or what the God of heaven had done for the Israelites. Other nations had heard about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. To expand on another point, I'm sure the knowledge of what happened to the Israelites was passed down from the Egyptians' fathers to their sons, and all of the stories of the plagues. I'm sure that became part of their living history for a long time.
Reason is one of the primary factors that the ancients had that modern evolutionary scientists today do not have.
Okay.
The ability to see creation and how it is so marvelous and that it is non-chaotic says something about a creator.
Yeah, absolutely.
They may not know his name. They had to guess and created gods to represent that power, but at least they reasoned very precisely that this couldn't have happened by accident.
For sure. Roger?
Many civilizations have some form of an account of a great major flood, a worldwide flood. It wasn't just a phenomenon that was recorded by Israel and their prophets and Moses, but all or many ancient civilizations have their own account of the flood.
For sure. That's really, it's really an interesting thing. There's a life-size recreation of the Ark of Noah out in Kentucky. Yeah, in Kentucky. And we got to go through it 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that. And inside, there's actually a whole section that talks about how it shows the flood narratives from like 20 or 30 different ancient civilizations about how it was recorded and passed down from one generation to the next, the story of the flood. And what's interesting was there's a lot of common threads between the whole thing. There was a favored family who was told to build a boat, and they built the boat, and they got all the animals with them, and then they survived the flood. And there's a whole bunch of, sometimes they add pieces, or they, the stories are not all the same, but there is a common thread between all of them where it all looks the same. What's kind of crazy is what they say the boat looked like in all of these stories is all different, which is really interesting because they've gone back and they've done like hydro tests on all of these different boat designs, and none of them work. They say if you build, one of the ancient civilizations said it was told to build a square boat, and they take, you can build a square boat and you can put it out there in the water, and it's a mess. It behaves incredibly poorly. It rocks from side to side. They said with a certain amount of waves, it will actually just break in half, and all sorts of stuff like that. And if your boat's too thin, it doesn't work. If your boat's too tall, there's a whole bunch of properties that it has to be just the way that it needs to be. Okay. All right. So today we have a whole bunch of things that can help us out. So we just talked about the laws of thermodynamics. Laws of thermodynamics are relatively new. I don't know. Does anyone know when they were first codified? I want to say like late 1800s or mid 1900s, something like that. But if you go back a couple thousand years ago, you don't have any of the really precise scientific things that we can rely on today that can kind of help us balance the scales for us, okay? So the ancient Greeks thought the universe was eternal. They had gods for everything, as did the Romans. but their gods were a little more mischievous. We talked about the ancient Hebrews. They thought they had the answer because God said so, and he made himself known, like he talked to the patriarchs. He performed miracles. He got them out of Egypt, all of those things that we just talked about. In North Africa, in the 11th century, they formulated what is called the Kalam cosmological argument. And it states that everything that begins has a cause. The universe had a beginning. Therefore, the universe had to have a cause. And this is what Caleb talked about a little while ago, okay? Everything that begins has a cause. The universe had a beginning, they formulated. Therefore, the universe had a cause, okay? How did they know the universe had a beginning? How did people in the 11th century know the universe had a beginning? Like, they didn't know about the Big Bang Theory. You know, they didn't think that that was a reasonable thing. How did people in the 1100s know? Because they were there. I think, therefore I am. Okay. There's actually two ways you can think about this that they figured out. There's the mathematical and there's a philosophical. There we go. Okay. The mathematical argument for the beginning goes like this. Okay. This is the infinite history problem. Okay. So this is what Caleb talked about with the infinite marbles. Okay. If I have an infinite amount of marbles, okay, and I give Ray all the even-numbered marbles, so I have 1, 3, 5, 7, he has 2, 4, 6, 8, and going to infinite, then I have an infinite amount of marbles, and Ray has an infinite amount of marbles, okay? If I have an infinite amount of marbles, and I give Linda all of the marbles labeled 5 and above, now I have taken an infinite amount of marbles, I've subtracted an infinite amount, and I'm left with 4. And then I can also just take an infinite amount of marbles, and I can just give them all to Steve. And now Steve has all the infinite marbles, and I'm left with 0, okay? This is why you can't do math with, you can't do transfinite math with infinite sums, because you will always get a different answer. And it's not that I can just give her, you know, all the marbles 5 and above. I could do it with any integer that I wanted to. I can give her all the ones 7, or all the ones 11, and all the ones 15, 100 and above. You can get any number that you want to if you add or subtract infinity, because infinity is not a real thing, regardless of what, you know, Buzz Lightyear says. So if you take infinity minus infinity, you can have infinity. You can take infinity, you can subtract it, you can get any number that you want to. And you can take infinity and you can subtract infinity and you can get 0. Okay? So, therefore, infinite things don't exist. They're a thing that we conceptualize when we're going through math problems. You know, you'll say, well, as this sum goes to infinity, then this thing will eventually happen. But the key thing is it never gets there. It's something that we rationalize in our heads. It's something we think through, but it's not something that ever actually happens, okay? So, it's not descriptive of what can happen in the real world. So in this situation, if you replace marbles with time, and you say, well, I'm not just going to subtract marbles, I'm going to subtract years, okay? I'm going to start in an infinite past, and I'm going to subtract, 1,500 years. I'm still in the infinite past. You know, I'm going to start in the infinite past, I'm going to subtract 37 billion years. You're still in the infinite past. It's still that you never get there, okay? Think about it this way. What date do you want to put in the time machine? Like, if the universe has always been here, if the universe has always existed, and you get the DeLorean, and you get to put in the number, and you say, I want to go back, and I want to see the earth being created. What day do you put in there? There isn't one. If the universe has always existed, oops, then there's no number that you can put in there that actually makes sense. Okay? We don't know what year the universe was created. It may have been a long time ago. According to scientists, it may have been billions of years ago. We don't know. But the point is it was an exact, definite point, because otherwise nothing else works. The math does not allow you to do anything else. So there had to have been a starting point at some point in the very distant past, we don't know how long, a long time ago, but there was an actual point where you could put in the year, whatever it was, and you could hop in your DeLorean and you could actually get there. All right. So here's the other thing that's kind of interesting. The scientific reasoning versus the personal reasoning. So scientific explanations exist in terms of initial conditions and natural laws. So another way to think of this is, well, some scientists will say, well, it was just set up that way to happen at that point, and then it just nudged itself off the cliff, and then it just started happening. It was all set up for the way that it needed to be set up at some point, and then something happened and it just pushed it off the case, okay? So like, if the conditions exist for water to freeze, okay? So think about it this way. If you have a container of water and it's below 32 degrees outside, then it will freeze, as we all know, okay? But if the initial the scientists are talking about a state where there's water outside, it's below 32 degrees, but it's not frozen yet. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about there's this initial condition where the world was created, okay, where there was something that allowed the world to happen. It was all set up just the way that it needed to be, and then something happened, they don't know what, and then boom, everything kicks off. The Big Bang Theory happens, okay? But if the conditions are in place for the thing to happen, then they would have always happened, okay? Like, you can't just have all the dominoes set up in a giant room and then just say, you know, they're just always there, everything's fine, and something has to come along and something has to push the domino, the first one, to create the chain reaction. You can't just have everything set up forever and it always is ready to go. Like, something has to push it. If you don't push it, if nobody comes in and pushes the first domino, then it always just stays there set up, ready to go. You would never have anything, okay? So this is a really cool point that I really like from one of the books that I read. It's the scientific reasoning versus the personal reasoning. So we have a question over here? Yes, sir.
I faced an evolutionary scientist, PhD professor on public television in North Carolina, and he was asked by the moderator how all life ended up on this planet. And he did exactly what you just said. He said, well, eons and eons of time ago, on the seashore, there were molecules that were heated up by the sun. And they started doing magical things, and soon life climbed up on the beach. And then they asked me, and I said, it's interesting that he started with everything ready to go. The sun,
Right.
the seashore, all of the ingredients. And it's not a reasonable and a scientific thing. And I just thought I'd throw that in there to emphasize what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. Why do we get to start from the case where everything's ready to go? Why are we starting from the case where all the dominoes are all lined up in the room, where it's going to make the cool pattern and do the cool thing? You know, why are we starting there? Like, how do we know that we got to start there? How come we didn't show up in an empty room or a room with a single domino? You know, all of those things are possibilities that could have existed. Okay. How much we got? 10, 15? Is that what we do? Yeah, sounds reasonable. Okay. We'll do this last bit. So, yeah. So there's two explanations for why something can happen to you. So in the morning, when we get up, I'll typically go in the kitchen, I'll make my coffee, and then I'll make my wife's tea, okay? And you could ask for the scientific reasoning for how her tea got made. Well, I took some water, I boiled it, you know, it heated up to the point of 212 degrees, and then I added a tea bag, and which infuses in the liquid, and all that good stuff happens. And you're like, okay, great. But what's the personal explanation is, I go make her tea in the morning because it makes her day just a little bit easier, and I love her. You know, that's the personal explanation. So when you're thinking about the universe, there's the scientific explanation that you can go to. How did the universe get here? Well, at some point in the distant past, the scientists will say the Big Bang Theory happened, and it started the chain reaction, that it all, you know, flowed from one state to the other, and, you know, a couple billion years later, here we are. The personal explanation is actually much more interesting to me. You know, if God has the ability to set things up the way that he wants them, and has the ability to line them all up, and then he has the ability to push the first domino and start everything the way that he wanted it to be started, there was a personal reason that he wanted it all to happen. He wanted to have a world where we were all part of it. He wanted a world where we all had the choice to either follow him or not follow him, either listen to his explanations or not, either make good choices or don't make good choices, and either, you know, someday either, you know, want to be with God or don't care that much about him. You know, he wanted a situation where we all had that option. There was a personal motivation on behalf of the Creator to set things up the way that he had set them up, to, you know, to go make the tea in the morning for the person that he loves, you know, to set up the world so that humans have a chance to be part of it, to find him, to want to have a choice to want to be with him or not. And that part about this whole thing is the really cool part about it. You know, if God created the world, and if he set all this stuff up, he had a really personal motivation for doing all of it. And the motivation is he cares for all of us. He wanted to be part of us. He wanted us to be with him. And that's just really, really neat and interesting to me. I love that part of it. So thank you all for your attention. Yes. One more comment. George, go for it.
Your discussion about the universe had to be all put together at the same time also carries over to the theory of evolution.
For sure.
It did not take millions or billions of years for human life to get the way it was, just as the universe did not take that long period of time because the dominoes would not be put together right. Same thing with life.
I agree.
It happened in a very short period of time.
I agree. I think the time scale is overstated. But I promise you we can get there either way. even if we believe in billions of years, which I don't think is reasonable for things we'll talk about later, but the time frame is inconsequential. We can find God one way or the other. Because I'll tell you what, 1 billion years is not enough time when we get to later parts. Thanks, appreciate it.